This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by supporters like you. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the efforts here at Trifles. Just go to patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 271, On the Scent with Sherlock Holmes, Part 3. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you're smelling great this week.
Yeah, I know.
What have you done with yourself?
Just the usual thing. I like to take fine herbs, oregano, cucumber, things from the garden, mix them up in a paste, sort of spread that around myself, get a little floral essence. You know, the wonderful thing is if I go out for a long walk, I find I attract these little dogs and birds. It's really wonderful.
Well, it's because you're so kind to them. Let's just leave it at that.
I hope so.
Well, this is episode 271. That means you can find the show notes at iHost.co/trifles271, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com page where this show resides. You can do all sorts of things. Poke around there. Look through our archives. And speaking of archives, we are recording this on International Women's Day. And it is Women's History month of March. And to celebrate that, we actually put together a playlist of 14 Trifles episodes that we've done in the past that have something to do with women. We will include a link to that in the show notes, which are again at iHost.co/trifles271. So you can check that out and celebrate women all month long with Trifles. Meanwhile, as Burt flips his pages around there, I will continue the patter here about supporting our show. Did you know that everyone who supports our show on Patreon gets an entry into monthly and quarterly drawings that we do? Monthly drawings give you a free back issue or back issues of the Baker Street Journal, and the quarterly drawings entitle you to a year's subscription of the Baker Street Journal. Just go to patreon.com/trifles or to our show notes. Well, we're rounding the corner on our third, or is that turd, episode in On the Scent with Sherlock Holmes. We've done 2 episodes previously where we've talked about just the general essence of London and of Victorian times, what it was like being around the world and people and machines and the city and all of that in Sherlock Holmes's time. And this is taken from a great book by Walter Shepherd, called On the Scent with Sherlock Holmes from Gaslight Publications in 1987. So, Burt, where did we leave our noses the last time we stuck them in here?
Well, over these episodes, and I think this is our 3rd episode, drawing on the Scent with Sherlock Holmes, we've had quite a journey. We started with Dogs, I believe, early on in the first part and the second part, common road sense, horse manure, dog dung, mechanical transport sense. And in this, our third and last visit to this book, I think it'll be the last one, we're on the route of obnoxious organic waste, solid rubbish. This teeming metropolis of London that Holmes and Watson walk around in, live in. Holmes frequently describes in different ways, as was proved such a challenge to Watson before he could hook up with Sherlock Holmes, has a huge number of people. And Shepard points out that obnoxious organic waste. Now, Shepard, again, to remind our listeners, is someone who was born, in the early part of the 20th century and who was writing a lot of this from his own personal memory of early London. Obnoxious organic waste was chiefly disposed of in hundreds and thousands of cesspits, though the entrails of animals from the slaughterhouses and much other offensive matter was still being thrown into the rivers and the sewers. And they took all this filth, which not infrequently included dead cats and dogs, into the Thames. But it was not then carried out to sea. That was the intent, of course. It was simply washed to and fro by the tides. And in many districts, such as Bermondsey, it poisoned the drinking water and occasioned widespread outbreaks of cholera. In 1832, more than 5,000 people died of the disease. But the death roll in the 1849 outbreak was 18,000, and that of 1854, the year when Sherlock Holmes was born, the death toll was nearly 20,000.
Can you imagine? I mean, look, I know people, when they think of obnoxious organic waste, they usually think of our show. But can you imagine having to stroll through London with all of this stuff sloshing about just hundreds of meters away? I mean, on a hot July day? Good grief.
Unbelievable. Shepard points out that during the so-called Great Stink of 1858, the stench arising from sewage drained into the Thames prevented the members of Parliament from using the committee rooms and library at the House of Commons, and the windows were hung with curtains soaked in chloride of lime, calcium chloride, to make the air breathable. And the last cholera epidemic was in 1866, but Shepard says London's highest death rate, 24.4 per thousand, chiefly attributed to the drains, was not reached until 1870, after which it slowly declined. Good grief. And in chapter 4 of A Study in Scarlet, there's an allusion to this, to a death in 1881 from typhoid fever. And I think it's John Rance who says to Holmes and Watson, on account of him that owns the house won't have the drains seen to. I think they're outside Lauriston Gardens at that point talking about that.
Goodness. So by 1869, the solid sewage had formed in the banks of the Thames, and it was so voluminous that it was said to be dangerous to shipping. You gotta navigate your ships through this stuff.
Navigate what?
Oh, ship. So the decision not to allow crude sewage to be discharged into the Thames wasn't given legal force until 1884, 15 years later. And that was when Holmes and Watson were undertaking the Greek Interpreter. So by 1877, Shepard says, when Holmes first came to London, domestic usages in town were outwardly much as they are today. So in suburban areas, as in the country, privies were often over cesspits, generally down the garden in wooden sheds. In the towns, the smell of bad drains was still too common for ordinary people to do more than give a wry smile in passing, and even the residences of the nobility and aristocracy were liable to suffer.
Well, and we have to salute the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, wonderful name, Bazalgette, Basil Gette, who came up with the scheme of constructing 6 large sewers right across the London area, parallel with the Thames, so that they could tap the existing sewers and kennels and rivers before they reached the Thames. And Shepard tells us a little bit about that. There was no chemical treatment of sewage in those days. And in 1882, the year after Holmes and Watson took rooms in Baker Street, it was proposed that the solids should be used for the raising of low-lying lands, or burnt or drug into the land, or carried away to sea. Your choice.
Now, can you imagine the committee that had to meet on that and make decisions as to what to do with the solids?
Yeah.
Can you do me a solid, man?
It really is amazing. I had no idea this was the case, around this time at the end of the 19th century. And we learn here that the year in which the Reggett Squires case happened in 1887, work was begun on 6 sludge ships, which were to take the solids out to sea and dump them in the deeps off the mouth of the Thames. But it wasn't until 1888. Well, now Shepard here says sign of foreign silver blaze, but I think most people think silver blaze was in 1890. Anyway, it wasn't until around 1888 that chemical treatment of sewage was undertaken. And the sludge ships were not all completed until 1895. My goodness.
Wow. So during the whole of their residence in London, then, Holmes and Watson must have regarded the smell of bad drains as a normal part of London life. Unfortunately, the sewers were then ventilated by gratings in the middle of the road, and so that bad smells would frequently drift down the streets. And in 1886, and that may be when the barrel coronet took place, that this was such a nuisance that a committee, Bert, recommended periodic cleaning of the sewers and supplying them with more fresh air. Yes, the fresh air for the sewers committee.
Yes. Fascinating. And then in 1898, which is around the time Shepard says of the dancing men, these gratings were supplemented by pipes that ran up the sides of buildings to roof level. But, he says, the evil was still present. I love this. In 1914, when sewer gas exploded in the post office telephone ducts.
Well, speaking of the evil still present, that means it's time for this quick break. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, back for the sweet smell of London.
And Shepard takes us into some of the neighborhoods. We mentioned Bermondsey before, which I gather is where the slaughterers were, the knackers' yards, the slaughterers' yards, and the glue factories, and many other odors that came from breweries. There were breweries in Billingsgate. There were breweries, and then Billingsgate was where the fish market was. And escaping coal gas. The interesting thing is that people thought the smell of escaping coal gas could be beneficial. Poor mothers who could not afford a doctor would wheel their prams up and down outside the gasworks, hoping thereby to cure their infants of such ailments as whooping cough. And Shepard says this was observed in practice outside the Croydon gasworks as late as 1927. And of course, in the case of the retired colorman, which I think is around 1898, Holmes readily distinguished the smell of gas from that of paint and so uncovered a murder.
Goodness gracious.
And then there are other gaseous smells, including those of naphtha, which illuminated the street market stalls after dark, and the acetylene burners, which smelt abominably when being lit or after getting blown out. And, we've got a whole bunch of decaying smells here. This isn't really isn't the most appetizing subject, but we could move on to the saltpeter. Now, gunpowder.
Well, wait a minute. I don't want to miss out on the opportunity here because I know you're jonesing for some cocktails right now, Bert, but, the common sense of the time, Shepard says that we should note, include those of decaying meat, sour milk, rancid butter. Those were the days before refrigerators. And, of course, only the owners of mansions processed ice houses. And I don't know if we ever talked about this as a related topic, but I wonder how Mrs. Hudson was fixed for an ice box in 221B Baker Street, and to what extent she would have her kitchen supplies refreshed by the butcher or the milkman.
Oh, that's interesting. No, I'm certain we've never talked about refrigeration in Baker Street.
Yeah.
Well, of course, the Victorian kitchen was not a hotbed of technology.
Well, speaking of hotbeds, why don't we get back to the saltpeter man?
Yes, the saltpeter man. Well, gunpowder, says Shepard, is made from saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, but the only sources of saltpeter known at the time were the urine and other excreta of animals, and scrapings from the walls and floors of stables and slaughterhouses and the earthen floors of dwelling houses. And saltpeter contains nitrogen until comparatively modern times. The only way you could find a considerable source of that was through organic waste.
That leads me to wonder, pets were popular back then, dogs, cats, etc. What did they do for kitty litter back then?
Oh, for kitty litter.
Yeah.
But there's another question there. You could turn that around and ask, when was kitty litter invented?
Well, there you go. So they must have just sent the cats down to the Thames.
Oh, dear. Well, and then Shepard gives us a little bit of history about saltpeter men who were empowered. Soils throughout the kingdom which were impregnated with animal matter were declared the property of the crown, and the saltpeter men were empowered and required to dig up the floors of all the dove houses and stables and cattle sheds and slaughterhouses and cellars to carry away the earth. Now, that, of course, is in the 17th century rather than in the 19th century. But it's an amazing history. And, of course, the demand for gunpowder continued through the 19th century. And when Watson was wounded at the Battle of Maiwand in 1880, gunpowder was still the sole explosive used in guns and rifles. And it was also being used, saltpeter was also being used for preserving meat and as an artificial fertilizer.
Well, and speaking of fertilizer, Shepard writes that by 1900, the motor omnibuses had already led to vast reductions in the numbers of horses required for transport. And before very long, tens of thousands of horses and the odors from more than 1,000 large stables had vanished from the London scene. So we may make the curious observation that the period of Holmes's residence in London coincided with the most noticeable whiffs of ammonia and ended with the first whiffs of petrol fumes. What a nice bookend.
Well, I prefer to think that as Watson was driving his Ford around, Holmes could again remark with some seriousness that the air of London was sweeter for his presence.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What things annoy you about our modern society? Now, many people feel that the thing that's most upsetting to them is that the individual rights, freedoms have been taken away.
Our rights, our freedoms.
You feel that
more important than that. They're taking away our smell.
Our what?
Our smells, our own individual smells.
How are they doing
They have
that?
a spritz, they have a spray for everything. Under the arms, in the nose, in the crotch. You don't know who the hell you're talking to anymore.
You mean that we can't...
They're taken away with all these...
So you don't know the difference
You don't know the difference between men and women, between who's who. Everybody smells like a strawberry. You walk past a fruit stand, you get hot. What the hell is that?
I know, that's true. That's
no way to
that
live.
is upsetting.
You can't live your life that way.
That is upsetting.
Sure, it's ridiculous.
Yes.